Somewhere beneath the dust of southern Iraq, in the broken silence of cities no one quite remembers building, fragments of clay still whisper names the modern tongue has forgotten how to pronounce. Names older than the Bible, older than the pyramids, older than the very word history itself. Names that once governed the sky, the water, the wind, the womb, the moon, the sun, and the storm. Names that built what the world now calls civilization, and then, somewhere along the long descent of millennia, fell silent. What if those who first taught humanity how to count, to write, to measure time, to plant grain, to grieve the dead were not who history claims they were? Before the body sinks any deeper into this quiet, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if what is being said here genuinely calms the mind. And before the next sentence begins, leave below where you are tonight and what time the night is whispering to you. There is something strangely intimate about knowing that somewhere across the curve of the world, another listener is letting these same forgotten names drift past them in the dark. The breath slows, the lights soften, the mind opens toward Mesopotamia, the land between rivers, where the first cuneiform sign was pressed into wet clay nearly 5,500 years ago. The Tigris drifted south, the Euphrates curled west. Between them lay floodplains so flat that the horizon never broke, and so fertile that the wheat grew taller than the men who tended it. And in that flatness, in that fertility, in that strange and almost sudden flowering, the first cities of the world began to rise. Eridu, Uruk, Nippur, Lagash, Kish. Names that today most travellers cannot find on any map, yet names that once ruled the imagination of an entire region, stretching from the Mediterranean shore to the Persian Gulf. What is most unsettling, perhaps, is not how grand those cities were, but how fully formed they appeared. The archaeologists who first uncovered Sumerian writing in the 19th century were left with a problem they have never quite resolved. The signs did not evolve slowly before their eyes. They surfaced already organized, already systemic, already bearing the marks of a civilization that seemed to know exactly what it was doing. Mathematics in base 60, the same system that still divides the hour into 60 minutes and the circle into 360 degrees, appeared in the earliest layers. Astronomical observation of the planet Venus across decades was already being recorded on tablets that predate the raising of Stonehenge. Star maps, lists of medicinal plants, contracts, receipts, love poems, laments for cities destroyed by storms no living person could remember. All of it surfacing as if pulled from somewhere already complete. And among the receipts and the laments, names began to repeat. 7 names, not random, never random, repeated together, ordered, listed in the same sequence across centuries and across rival cities. The Sumerians called them simply the great gods. The Akkadians later wrote of them as Ilani Rabuti, the great deities, or more pointedly as those who decreed the fates. 7 gods who, according to the texts, gathered in council, judged the destinies of mortals, and authored the unspoken architecture of the world. Anu, Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag, Nanna, Utu, Inanna. The number itself, 7, is a quiet wound across the world's mythologies. 7 sages in Vedic tradition, 7 days of creation in Hebrew scripture, 7 heavens in Islamic cosmology, 7 sacred stars in the Pleiades, 7 Hathors in Egyptian belief, 7 sages of ancient Greece, 7 hills of Rome, 7 dwarves in the older European folklores. Each tradition has tended to claim the number as its own invention, and yet, traced backward through the layers of clay and stone, none of them predates the cuneiform tablets where the 7 of Sumer first lit the human imagination. There is something in the marrow of memory that refuses to forget that number, and the question no professor of ancient languages will say too loudly, but that every honest reader of these tablets must eventually face is whether the 7 were a coincidence, or whether they were inherited from somewhere already older than memory itself. What survives of these 7 beings is only fragments. Long inscriptions have been broken, tablets have been scattered through the museums of Berlin and London, and Baghdad and Istanbul, with countless thousands more still buried beneath the looters' pits of modern Iraq. Entire hymns survive in only 2 or 3 lines. Entire epics survive with the central passages missing, and what was deliberately destroyed, what Babylonian scribes once erased, what later Assyrians rewrote, what early Christian and Islamic chroniclers were instructed to omit, what colonial archaeologists shipped overseas without recording may never be fully recovered. To speak of these 7 gods is to speak across an immense silence, and to recognise that whatever passes the lips here tonight is only the surface of something much older, much wiser, and possibly much more disturbing than the textbooks have ever admitted. And so the question forms, as it always does on these long nights when the wind moves softly through the curtain and the mind drifts toward what it cannot quite remember. Why did the Sumerians insist that civilization was given to them? Not earned, not invented, not slowly perfected by trial and error across uncounted generations, but given by whom? And why, in their telling, were the gifts so unsettlingly complete? Kingship, law, music, weaving, the plough, the brick, the canal, the art of writing itself. Why did they call themselves the black-headed people, and speak as if they had inherited rather than discovered? And why, across every dynasty, every empire that succeeded them, every conqueror who burned their cities and stole their statues, did the names of the 7 remain almost untouched, repeated, copied, smuggled forward into Babylon, into Assyria, into Persia, and quietly into every religious vocabulary the West would later inherit? Tonight, the first of those 7 steps forward, the most remote, the least worshipped in the end, the one who watched everything from a place so distant that even the priests in time began to forget what his face was meant to look like. The sky himself. In the oldest layers of cuneiform, where the wedge-shaped marks are still half-rounded, and the scribes had not yet settled on the conventions that would govern the next 2,000 years of writing, a single sign appears again and again. A simple star, 8-pointed, sometimes 6, scratched into the soft clay as if the hand that pressed it knew it was inscribing something larger than a letter. That sign was Dingir, the determinative placed before any divine name. And by the strictest reading of those earliest texts, it was originally one name, only one, before it ever meant anything else. An, the sky, the above, the unreachable. What is striking is that this same sign, when read aloud, was not given a long mythological description in the way later gods would be. There was no detailed origin story, no biography of his youth, no tales of his early adventures. He simply was, the vault above the world, the cold dome of stars, the endless quiet from which weather, light, and judgment descended. To the Sumerians of Uruk, where his great temple, the Inanna, the house of heaven, would stand for nearly 3,000 continuous years, he was the father of all that mattered, and yet, paradoxically, the one who appeared least often in the rituals that filled the day. A god so vast, so abstract that ordinary worship could barely contain him. A god whose absence from daily prayer was itself a form of reverence. Anu, as the later Akkadian tongue would call him, was not a god the average farmer addressed when the irrigation channels failed or the lambs were born sickly. For such matters, smaller gods were petitioned. Closer gods, gods whose ears were said to be open to the lowing of cattle and the breath of mothers in labour. Anu was reserved for the very largest of questions, for moments when an entire city stood at the edge of destruction, or when a king required confirmation that his reign had been sanctioned by something beyond his own ambition. His name appears on the boundary stones of treaties between empires. His authority is invoked when curses are laid upon those who would alter the inscriptions of conquered territory. He is the witness of last resort, the seal pressed onto destiny itself. And yet, for all this remote majesty, the texts that have survived describe him in language unsettlingly precise. He sits, they say, upon a throne in the highest heaven, surrounded by a court of 7 judges. He wears a crown of horns, the universal Sumerian symbol of divine power, a crown that would later be borrowed, reshaped, and quietly reattributed by the religions that followed. He holds in his hand a staff and a ring, the same staff and ring that, in much later Mesopotamian iconography, would be passed down to his son and eventually become the symbol of righteous kingship across the entire ancient Near East. He oversees the gathering of the Anunnaki, the children of An, a word whose meaning has been debated and disputed and weaponized in modern times to mean almost anything, but which in the strictest grammatical reading of Sumerian means simply those who came down from An, the descendants of the sky. Here the mind begins to grow uneasy, because the texts do not treat this descent as metaphor. The Anunnaki, according to multiple independent compositions written across nearly 2 millennia, are said to have arrived upon the earth at a specific time, in specific numbers, and to have divided the world among themselves through a process the Sumerians called the casting of lots. Some received the heavens, some received the underworld, some received the dry land. The number repeatedly given for the principal Anunnaki is 50. The number of the Igigi, the lesser celestial beings who laboured alongside them in the early ages, is given as 300. These are not vague mythological flourishes. They are recorded with the same accountancy precision that the Sumerians applied to grain shipments and beer rations, as if someone at some point had felt it necessary to count. What the modern mind makes of this depends entirely on the lens through which it chooses to read. The standard academic position is that these are anthropomorphized nature spirits, projections of the rhythms of climate and harvest onto an imagined heavenly court. And there is, undeniably, much in the cuneiform record that supports this. Anu rises with the dome of the sky. Enlil moves in the storm. Enki dwells in the underground fresh water. Each great god has a domain that corresponds to a feature of the natural world. To call them nothing more than poetic personifications is not an unreasonable reading. It is, in fact, the safest reading, but it is also the reading that requires the most aggressive editing of the source material, because the tablets themselves do not speak of metaphor. They speak of names, of cities founded by specific gods, of decrees issued and rescinded, of conflicts among the divine council that ended in actual measurable consequences for the land of Sumer. They speak of Anu's withdrawal from active rule, an event the texts treat almost like a historical incident, with a date and a reason and a transfer of authority, and they speak of him in the way one might speak of a great-grandfather whom no one alive has ever met, but whose decisions still bind the family to this day. There is a tone of fading reverence, of awe drifting toward forgetting, that no purely literary mythology produces by accident. The question then hangs unanswered in the silence of the museums where his tablets are kept. Why did the first civilization in human history begin its theology not with a creator who shaped the world by hand, as the later Hebrew tradition would, but with a remote sovereign who had already retreated, already delegated, already grown distant from the affairs of mortals by the time the first scribe was born? What kind of memory produces a god who is, from the very beginning, half absent? And what kind of civilization places at the head of its pantheon a being whose primary characteristic is that he is no longer actively present? It is as if the Sumerians inherited not a religion of origins, but a religion of aftermath. As if the most important act of their highest god had already happened before they were ever there to witness it. Tonight, perhaps, the question itself is enough to carry into the next part of the journey. Because if Anu had already withdrawn, then someone or something had to step forward to take his place. Someone whose presence on earth was anything but distant. Someone whose breath was said to move through the storms and whose word was said to set the fates of cities in motion. And the silence that follows Anu's name in the tablets is broken almost immediately by the rising voice of another. There is a strange grammar in the earliest Sumerian hymns, a structural absence that no translator has ever quite been able to explain away. When the scribes of Uruk wrote of Anu in the very oldest tablets, they wrote of him in the past tense. Not always, not consistently, but often enough that the pattern has been noticed and quietly catalogued by Assyriologists for over a century. The god of the sky, the supreme ruler, the father of the divine council, is described as having spoken, as having decreed, as having given, rarely as speaking now, rarely as decreeing in the present moment, as if the listeners in the temple already understood the voice they were invoking was not a voice that would answer. This is the unsettling shape of what scholars of comparative religion have come to call the Deus Otiosus, the idol god, the high god who has withdrawn from the world he made. It is not a Mesopotamian peculiarity. It is in fact one of the most widespread patterns in human religious experience, surfacing independently across cultures that could not possibly have communicated with one another. Among the Yoruba of West Africa, the sky god Olodumare is honoured, but rarely petitioned, because his attention has long since turned elsewhere. Among the indigenous peoples of the Tierra del Fuego archipelago, far at the southern tip of South America, ethnographers in the early 20th century recorded an almost identical theology, a creator deity who finished his work and then receded into a quiet so absolute that no shrine was ever raised to him. Among the ancient Vedic Indians, Dyaus Pitar, the sky father whose very name is etymologically the same as Zeus and Jupiter, and the Latin word deus itself, fades within a few centuries from the central position of worship into a name barely whispered in the Rig Veda. Among the early Greeks before Zeus, there was Uranos, who was unseated, castrated, mutilated, and pushed out of the story so violently that later writers struggle to remember what he had originally meant. Among the early Romans, Caelus, the sky personified, survives only as an architectural detail. The pattern is too consistent to dismiss. Across continents, across language families, across millennia, the highest god of an original pantheon vanishes, withdraws, falls silent, or is overthrown. The throne remains, but the one who sat upon it has slipped beyond the edge of memory. And what fills his place in nearly every tradition is a younger and more violent god, a god of storms and weapons, a god of judgment and conquest, not the source, the successor. In Mesopotamia, that successor was Enlil, and the moment of transition between father and son is not depicted as a peaceful inheritance. The Sumerian hymns preserve a curious tension around it, a discomfort, a sense that something was taken rather than given. Some compositions describe Enlil as having seized the tablets of destinies from the hand of Anu. Other compositions, equally ancient, describe Anu as having freely placed them into Enlil's keeping. The contradiction itself is the clue. In any historical record, when two opposing accounts survive of the same event, it usually means the event was politically contested in its own time. It means that someone at some point had a reason to rewrite what had happened. And it means that the truth of the matter, whatever it was, has been buried under the polite revisions of later scribes who served whichever god was now in power. What is striking is that this same pattern, the withdrawn father replaced by the storm-wielding Scots son, recurs in nearly every Indo-European mythology that came after. Uranos is overthrown by Kronos and then by Zeus. The Hindu pantheon shifts its emphasis from Dyaus Pitar to Indra, the wielder of the thunderbolt. The Norse remember a vague Tyr who once held all authority before being eclipsed by Odin, and Odin in turn shadowed by Thor. Even within Christian Europe, the gentle and abstract god, the father of medieval theology, is gradually overshadowed in popular devotion by the more immediate and more vividly imagined Christ. The motion is always the same. The high one fades, the active one rises, The original is forgotten in favour of the more useful. And here the question becomes uncomfortable. Because if so many cultures, separated by oceans and by tens of thousands of years of independent development, all preserve the same memory of a withdrawn high god, what exactly are they preserving? Is it a coincidence of structural psychology, as the Romanian historian Mircea Eliade once argued, simply the way the human mind tends to organize the divine? Is it a fading echo of a single original religion that once united all of humanity in the deep prehistoric past, as the more controversial writers of comparative mythology have proposed? Or is it, as a smaller and more cautious group of scholars has begun to wonder, the memory of an actual event dimmed by retelling, of a presence that was once nearer to the human world and that, for reasons no surviving text quite explains, departed? The Sumerians themselves were not shy about what they believed had happened. In the great composition known today as the Enuma Elish, written in its preserved form during the second millennium, before the Common Era but drawing on traditions far older, the transfer of cosmic authority is described in language so concrete that it reads less like myth than like a chronicle of an old political reorganization. Anu retreats, Enlil ascends, later Marduk of Babylon will rise above them both, and the older gods will be quietly demoted in the official liturgies, their temples allowed to crumble, their priesthoods absorbed or starved out. What had once been the central worship of the entire region becomes a memory, a footnote, a name on an old foundation stone, a phrase muttered by a temple keeper who no longer fully remembers why his ancestors had carved it there. This is the pattern of religious transition as it actually occurs in human history, not the gentle ripening of new ideas, not the open-minded incorporation of older truths, rather the so deliberate erasure of what came before, often justified by the claim that the older gods had themselves agreed to step down. It is the same pattern by which the Greco-Roman temples of late antiquity were emptied and rededicated to new saints, the same pattern by which the sacred wells of Celtic Britain were rebranded as Christian shrines, the same pattern by which countless indigenous deities across the Americas and Africa were folded into syncretic worship and then quietly forgotten as their original meanings dissolved. If this is what happened to Anu, then what was being protected? What was being absorbed? What was being erased? Why did so many later traditions remember only that there had once been a higher god, but could no longer remember what he had taught, what he had decreed, or why his withdrawal had been necessary? And what exactly did Enlil bring with him when he descended from the sky to take the throne his father had left empty? To stand today on the broken mound of Nippur in the flatlands south of modern Baghdad is to stand upon what the Sumerians once believed to be the navel of the world. There is little left to look at. A scattering of low ridges, the remains of mud brick walls eroded to almost nothing by 5,000 years of wind and flood. A few outlines where excavators have traced the foundations of buildings whose original height no one can now imagine. And yet, in the earliest geography of the Mesopotamian mind, this was the Duran key, the bond between heaven and earth, the precise point upon the surface of the world where the realm of the gods met the realm of mortals. It was here the texts insisted that Enlil took up his seat after his father withdrew. Here that the great assembly of the gods convened, here that the destinies of kings were ratified or annulled. Why Nippur of all places? It was never the largest city, it was never the wealthiest, it controlled no trade route of particular importance. It produced no great army. It was now by every practical measure a strange choice for the spiritual capital of a civilization that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the foothills of the Zagros Mountains. And yet, for nearly 2,000 years, every dynasty that rose to power in Mesopotamia, whether Sumerian, Akkadian, Amorite, Kassite, or Assyrian, considered itself illegitimate until its king had been formally crowned in the temple of Enlil at Nippur. The kings of the kings of Babylon, the kings of Nineveh, all of them made the same pilgrimage. All of them placed their hands upon the same altar. All of them invoked the same name to authorize their reigns. What gave Nippur this hold over the imagination of the ancient world? The simplest answer, and the one most often given, is that Enlil resided there. But that only displaces the question, because no one has ever satisfactorily explained why Enlil should have chosen that particular spot. The Sumerians themselves seem to have had no clear memory of why. The texts simply state, as if reciting an inheritance whose source had long since been forgotten, that this was the place, the bond between heaven and earth, the pillar that held the sky from collapsing onto the world. The very name Enlil carries within it a secret that translators have argued over for more than a century. The element En meant Lord. The element Lil has been translated as wind, as breath, as storm, as spirit, as ghost, and as atmosphere. Each translation captures something the others miss. He was not merely the god of weather, he was the god of the invisible substance that fills the space between the earth and the sky, the medium through which sound travels, through which breath enters the body, through which the spoken word carries its weight. In a culture that believed words could shape reality, that the naming of a thing was an act of creation, the god of breath and air was, in the deepest sense, the god of language itself, the lord of what moves between us when we speak. And it was Enlil, the Sumerian tradition insisted, who held in his keeping the Dub-Nam-Tar, the tablets of destinies. These were not metaphorical, they are described in the text as physical objects, clay tablets inscribed with the fates of all things, of nations, of cities, of individual lives, of the very gods themselves. Whoever held the tablets held the power to alter what had been decreed, to rewrite, to amend, to erase. There is a long and disturbing tradition in the cuneiform literature concerning the theft, recovery, and contested ownership of these tablets, a tradition so persistent that some scholars have begun to wonder whether the motif of the Book of Fate in nearly every later religion, the Sefer HaHayim of Hebrew tradition, the Kitab al-Markum of Islamic apocalypse, the Liber Vitae of Christian theology, the heavenly registers in which every human action is recorded, all trace back to this single Mesopotamian image of a god who possessed the writing of the world. What is unsettling here is not the existence of the motif. Many cultures have imagined heavenly books. What is unsettling is the specificity. The Sumerians did not speak vaguely of divine knowledge. They spoke of a particular set of tablets kept in a particular sanctuary, in a particular city, in the keeping of a particular god. They named the room. They described its layout. They listed the rituals required to enter its presence. They recorded the names of priests authorized to handle the tablets and the penalties for those who would attempt to read them without permission. It is, by any reasonable description, a record of an actual administrative practice, the kind of documentation one finds for real archives that really existed, the kind one finds for the granaries of the temple economy or the storage rooms where the king's correspondence was kept. And if the tablets existed, they have long since vanished. Nippur was sacked many times in its long history, by the Elamites, by the Gutians, by later Babylonian factions, by Assyrian kings who looted its temple stores, by Persian armies, by the slow indifference of climate change as the Euphrates shifted its course and the city's irrigation collapsed. Whatever the tablets contained, if they were physical objects at all, they are not in the collections of any modern museum. They are listed in no inventory, they appear in no catalogue, they survive only as references in other texts, hymns that name them, prayers that invoke them, threats that warn against their misuse. The thing itself has either been destroyed, or it has been quietly removed from the historical record by hands that did not wish for it to be remembered. There is a tradition, preserved in the late Babylonian writings of the priest Berossus, that the destinies of cities could be altered by the gods only through these tablets, and that certain ages of the world had been ended, and others begun by the rewriting of what was inscribed upon them. The implication, never quite stated outright, is that history itself was not fixed, that what was remembered, what was preserved, what was passed down to later generations, was the product of an editorial process conducted at the level of the divine, that the past, as it now stands in the textbooks, is not the past as it actually occurred, but the past as it was last allowed to be written. If such a notion seems extravagant, it is worth pausing to ask why nearly every ancient civilization that rose after Sumer felt the need to inherit the same image. Why the Egyptians invented Thoth, the god of writing, who kept the records of every soul. Why the Hindus imagined Chitragupta, the divine scribe who recorded every action of every human being. Why the Hebrews wrote of the book in which God remembers or forgets those whom he chooses. Why the Christians of late antiquity imagined the Lamb opening 7 seals upon a scroll whose contents had been hidden since before the foundation of the world. Each of these traditions, in its own way, preserves the same fundamental claim, that somewhere, in some keeping not accessible to ordinary mortals, the true text of what has happened is held. And if such a text exists, and if its keeper was once Enlil, lord of breath and storm, then the silence that surrounds his ruined temple at Nippur takes on a different weight. It is not the silence of a god forgotten. It is the silence of a record that, for reasons no one alive can quite explain, was not allowed to survive. Long before the rain began, the tablets say, the gods had grown weary, not of one another, not of the slow work of governing the cosmos. They had grown weary of the noise, the unrelenting noise of the creatures they themselves had made. The Atrahasis epic, one of the oldest sustained narratives ever recovered from the soil of Mesopotamia, preserves this strange and almost domestic grievance with a clarity that has unsettled scholars since its first translation in the late 19th century. Humans, the text records, had multiplied across the floodplains. Their cities had grown loud, their voices rose into the upper air, into the very chambers where the divine council met to deliberate, and Enlil, in his vast and storm-darkened authority, could not sleep. It is an image both absurd and terrifying. The supreme administrator of the earth, the holder of the tablets of destinies, the lord of breath and atmosphere, lying awake in his celestial bedchamber, irritated by the murmur of the very species he had been entrusted to govern. The text does not soften this matter. He calls the assembly together. He proposes a remedy, not reform, not relocation, not negotiation, erasure. Plague, the first attempt. Drought, the second. Famine, the third. And when each of these proved insufficient, when humanity refused to be quietly culled by hunger or thirst or sickness, the final solution was decreed. A flood great enough to wash the species from the face of the world. A flood that would restore the silence that the upper heavens required. What is striking about the Atrahasis account is not the existence of a flood myth. Nearly every culture that has ever inhabited a river valley or a coastal plain preserves some memory of catastrophic inundation. What is striking is the bureaucratic precision of the divine decision. The assembly votes, the decree is recorded, the implementation is scheduled, the reasoning is documented, and then, almost as if the chronicler could not bear to leave the matter morally untroubled, a single dissenting voice is recorded. Enki, the god of the freshwater abyss, the wise one, the deepest among the 7, refused to consent. He could not openly defy the council. He could not break the oath of silence he had sworn alongside his brothers. But he could, in the careful Sumerian phrase, speak to the reed wall. He could whisper through a screen. He could let his words be overheard by one who happened, by no apparent coincidence, to be standing just on the other side. That one was Ziusudra in the oldest Sumerian version, Atrahasis in the Akkadian, Utnapishtim in the Great Standard Babylonian recension of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and, in the much later Hebrew rewriting, Noah. The continuity of the narrative across nearly 2,000 years of cuneiform tradition is so close in detail that even the most conservative biblical scholars have, since the discovery of the Mesopotamian originals in the 19th century, conceded that the Hebrew account did not arise independently. The arc of identical dimensions, the 7 days of warning, the release of birds to test the receding waters, the mountain upon which the vessel comes to rest, the offering of sacrifice as the waters fall, the promise that such a destruction shall never be repeated, the exact narrative architecture, preserved across millennia, across languages, across the rise and fall of civilizations. But the Sumerian version differs from the Hebrew one in a single crucial respect, and the difference is one that almost no Sunday school has ever been comfortable examining. In the Hebrew telling, the flood is a moral judgment. Humanity has become wicked. The earth is filled with violence. The waters come as punishment for sin. In the Mesopotamian original, the flood has no such ethical framing whatsoever. Humanity is not wicked. Humanity is simply too many and too loud. The gods have not been offended by injustice, they have been disturbed by population. The flood is not a verdict upon human evil. It is, in the bluntest sense, an administrative culling, a pest control measure at planetary scale. What does it mean that the oldest version of one of the most universally retold stories in human history was not, in its original form, a moral parable at all? What does it mean that the moralization, the framing in terms of sin and judgment, was added later, by scribes serving a different theology, in a different city, at a different time, who could not accept that the divine decision to drown the world might have been undertaken for reasons as petty and as bureaucratic as the original tablets describe, and what, in the slow erasure of the Mesopotamian framing, was being protected from the eyes of later readers? There is a further detail that the Hebrew tradition removed entirely. In the Mesopotamian flood, the gods themselves are nearly destroyed by what they have unleashed. The Atrahasis text describes them cowering in the upper heavens like frightened dogs, watching the waters rise beyond what they had calculated. The mother goddess weeps for the children of her own making. The lesser deities, the Anunnaki of the underworld, retreat into the deepest places. The flood, once begun, exceeds the ability of its authors to contain it, and when at last the rain ends and the ark rests upon the mountain, the gods descend to the smoke of Ziusudra's sacrifice, not as triumphant judges, but as starving beings who have been deprived for too long of the offerings that sustained them. This is the detail that the Hebrew rewriting could not include: a god who needs to be fed, a council of beings whose own survival depends upon the worship of the very mortals they have just attempted to exterminate. The implication scattered across the older tablets, but never quite gathered into a single declaration, is that the relationship between gods and humans in the Mesopotamian imagination was one of mutual dependence. The gods made humans because they themselves required labourers. Humans served the gods because they themselves required the irrigation and the harvest that the gods controlled. When the contract broke down, when the noise grew too loud, the gods attempted to dissolve the arrangement, and they nearly destroyed themselves in the process. It is impossible to read these passages without sensing that something more than mythology is being recorded. The texts are too uncomfortable, too inconvenient for the theological purposes of their later inheritors to have been invented for any obvious ideological agenda. They are preserved as if their authors had no choice but to record them, even when the implications were difficult, even when the gods came out looking smaller and more frightened than any reasonable religious purpose would require. And this, in the strange logic of historical evidence, is often the surest sign that one is looking at a memory rather than an invention. Mythology that flatters its authors is suspect. Mythology that embarrasses them tends to preserve something older than the authors themselves. The figure who emerges most clearly from the wreckage of the flood narrative is not Enlil, the lord who ordered it, not Anu, the high god who allowed it. It is the one who broke the divine silence to save a single human family, the one who, in every version that has come down across the millennia, is described as the most sympathetic of the gods, the most cunning, the closest to humanity, and the only one who seems to have understood that whatever the others had decreed, the loss of mortal life upon the earth would also be a loss of something the gods themselves needed. He is the next figure who must step forward into the lamplight of this telling, the keeper of the deep waters, the shaper of the first humans, the whisperer through the reed wall. The place where Enki first stepped onto the dry land of memory is a small mound in the southernmost reach of Mesopotamia, now miles from any water, where a few scattered stones still mark what was once the city of Eridu. To the Sumerians, Eridu was not simply old, it was the old of the first, the original, the city before all other cities. The Sumerian king list, that strange catalogue of rulers whose earliest reigns are recorded as lasting tens of thousands of years, opens with a single declaration that has unsettled every reader who has paused over it. When kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. Not invented in Eridu, not developed in Eridu. Lowered, brought down, delivered, fully formed from somewhere above. Archaeology has confirmed, with a precision that few mythological claims ever achieve, that Eridu was indeed among the oldest inhabited sites in the region. Excavations conducted in the mid-20th century, supplemented by the more recent work of Iraqi and Italian teams, have traced occupation layers there back to the late 6th millennium before the Common Era, well over 7,000 years ago. Beneath the surface of the mound, 18 successive temple foundations have been uncovered, each built directly upon the ruins of the one before, each dedicated to the same god, each preserving in its architecture the same essential plan. The continuity is extraordinary. For nearly 4,000 years, the inhabitants of that single sacred precinct rebuilt their shrine to the same being, in the same place, on the same axis, without ever apparently feeling the need to start over. Whatever Enki was to them, he was not a god they were willing to lose. What is more, the deepest of those temple levels are older than the development of cuneiform writing itself. They are older than the wheel in any form that has been preserved. They are roughly contemporary with the first deliberate cultivation of barley in the marshlands of the Persian Gulf, when sea levels were still rising and the coastline lay considerably north of where it stands today. The earliest inhabitants of Eridu were, in fact, building a temple before they had any clear way to record what it was for. The god they worshipped there had no name that survives from that period. The form of the worship is largely unknown. And yet, when the cuneiform tablets at last begin to speak several thousand years later, the god of Eridu emerges with a clarity so sudden and so complete that he reads as if he had been there all along, waiting for someone to learn to write. His name in Sumerian was Enki. En, the Lord, Kai, the earth, the Lord of the earth. But this title was a kind of strange compression, because the texts almost immediately complicate it. Enki was not the lord of the surface. He was not the master of fields and herds in the open sky. He was the lord of what lay beneath. The Abzu, the freshwater abyss. The deep aquifer that wells up unseen beneath the marshlands of southern Iraq, that bubbles into springs and seeps into wells, that gives the land its life from below. To stand at Eridu in the original geography was to stand at the very edge of the world's fresh water, where the Tigris and Euphrates and the older, now vanished river of the Persian Gulf basin once converged. The god of that place was the god of what made life possible at all. Water, wisdom, the thing beneath the thing. And when humanity is created, in the Mesopotamian account it is Enki who designs them. Not Anu, the remote sky father. Not Enlil, the storm lord who would later prefer to drown them. Enki. The composition known as Enki and Ninma, recovered from a series of broken tablets first published in the early 20th century, preserves the scene with a domestic intimacy that has rarely been matched in any later religious literature. The lesser gods, the texts say, were exhausted from the labour of digging the canals and tending the fields. They came to Enki, who slept in the deep, and woke him with their complaints. He rose, he consulted with the mother goddess. Together they descended to the clay pits. They took up the clay of the Abzu, mixed it with the blood of a slain god, and shaped from this compound the first beings who would bear the labour of the gods upon their backs, humans. Made not as a triumphant act of creation, but as a workaround, a solution to a logistical crisis among the divine. The detail that has caused more controversy than any other in modern interpretation is the blood. The Sumerian and Akkadian texts are unambiguous. A god was killed. His blood was added to the clay. Without the blood, the clay would have been only clay. With it, the new creatures could think, could remember, could speak, could resent, could grieve. The divine substance carried into the mortal vessel something that the soil alone could not provide. The texts call this carried substance the etamu, sometimes translated as ghost or spirit, the part of the human being that survives the body, that retains memory, that owes its origin not to the earth, but to the slain god. There is, embedded in the very anatomy of the first Mesopotamian human, the buried implication that consciousness itself is borrowed from elsewhere, that every person carries within them a fragment of something that was once divine and was, at the very beginning, deliberately broken in order to bring them into being. It is hard to read this without thinking of the much later traditions that echo it. The Hebrew account in which God forms the human from the dust of the earth and breathes into his nostrils the breath of life, animating the clay with a divine neshama. The Egyptian account in which Khnum shapes mortals upon his potter's wheel from the silt of the Nile. The Greek account in which Prometheus moulds the first humans from earth, and Athena gifts them the spark of mind. The Vedic account in which Purusha is sacrificed and dismembered to bring forth the elements of human society. In each case, the same essential architecture. Earth, plus something taken from a sacrificed or borrowed divinity, equals a being capable of self-awareness. The continuity is too widespread to dismiss, and too specific to attribute to chance. Somewhere in the deep prehistoric memory of the species, the story keeps surfacing that what makes a human is not merely the body, but the residue of something that had to die in order for that body to wake. What Enki gave the first humans, however, did not end with their making. He gave them, the tablets insist, the me, the decrees of civilization, a list so extensive, so specific that one of the surviving compositions devotes hundreds of lines simply to enumerating them. Kingship, priesthood, truth, falsehood, music, carpentry, metalwork, the brick, the basket, the arts of sex, the arts of war, the descent into the underworld, the ascent to the throne. Each me was a particular kind of knowledge, a specific decree of how a particular thing was to be done in the world. And each one, the texts insist, was kept in the safekeeping of Enki at Eridu, until the day they would be stolen, or perhaps given freely by another, by a younger god, by a goddess whose hunger for the gifts of civilization would, in one of the strangest stories ever recorded in clay, set in motion the slow unravelling of everything Enki had built. In the great temple precinct of Eridu, where the walls of the Iabzu, the House of the Deep, rose above the marshes in their final monumental form some 4,000 years ago, there is said to have been a chamber that no ordinary worshipper was permitted to enter. The texts call it simply the place where the me are kept. Its location within the complex is described with frustrating vagueness in the surviving hymns, but the existence of the room itself is repeated across multiple independent sources. It was apparently a kind of archive, not a library of texts, something stranger, a repository of the decrees themselves, the active principles of civilization, the patterns by which kingship and priesthood and craft and song were said to operate. To hold the me was to hold the operating instructions for human society, and Enki, the wise one, the keeper of the freshwater abyss, had held them since the beginning. What happened next is recorded in a composition known to modern Assyriologists as Inanna and Enki. It is among the most peculiar narratives ever recovered from the soil of Mesopotamia, and it has resisted comfortable interpretation since the first fragments were translated in the early 20th century. The story begins simply. Inanna, the young goddess of Uruk, decides to visit her elder kinsman Enki at his sanctuary in Eridu. She arrives. He welcomes her. A feast is prepared. The two of them drink together, and as the beer rises in Enki's blood, the wise Kend, who had never been known to make a careless decision in any other tale, begins to give away the contents of his archive. One me at a time, then several, then dozens. By the end of their drinking, Inanna has accumulated, by Enki's own apparent consent, the foundational decrees of civilization itself. She loads them onto her skyboat. She sets sail back to Uruk. When Enki awakens, the texts say his hangover is theological. He realizes what he has done. He sends his minister Isimud to demand the me back. Inanna refuses. Enki sends sea monsters to capture her vessel. She fights them off. He sends storm demons. She defeats them. The chase continues across the southern marshlands as the most powerful god of the Mesopotamian pantheon tries, repeatedly and unsuccessfully, to recover what he has lost, while the younger goddess sails toward her own city with the gifts of civilization in her hold. And in the end, Enki simply gives up. Inanna arrives at Uruk to general rejoicing. The mere unloaded. The city receives them. The transfer is complete. What this story preserves beneath its surface of feast and chase and divine slapstick is the memory of a transition not merely of power, but of the very location of civilization itself. Before Inanna's voyage, the texts strongly imply the decrees of human life were held at Eridu, the oldest of cities, in the keeping of the oldest of the surviving great gods. After her voyage, they were held at Uruk, a much younger city, in the keeping of a goddess whose worship had only recently risen to prominence. Eridu, in archaeological fact, was already in decline by the time Uruk became the dominant power of the region. The city that had been the spiritual centre of the world for nearly 4,000 years was, by the late 4th millennium, beginning the slow fade that would leave it abandoned within another 1500. Uruk, by contrast, was entering its first great florescence, becoming the largest city in the world, possibly the first true metropolis in human history, with a population that some estimates place at 50,000 or more at its peak. The story of Inanna's theft of the me, then, is not merely a charming tale of divine intoxication. It is, if read with the careful eye that any good historian brings to mythological evidence, a politically charged account of how the cultural and religious centre of southern Mesopotamia shifted from one city to another. And it is told, crucially, from the perspective of the city that received the gifts, not from the perspective of the city that lost them. The texts that have survived are largely Urukian compositions. They celebrate what was acquired. They are silent on what was lost. They do not record what the priests of Eridu thought of the matter. They do not preserve the laments that surely must have been sung in the older sanctuary as its power drained northward into the temples of a brighter and noisier rival. This is the recurring shape of the motif. Civilization, in nearly every mythology that has ever attempted to account for its own origins, is described not as something invented but as something taken, stolen, carried away, wrested from a guardian who had held it close. Among the Greeks, Prometheus steals fire from the workshop of Hephaestus and brings it down to humanity at the cost of his own eternal torment. Among the Polynesians, Maui hauls up the lands themselves from the depths of the sea, fishing for them with a hook he was not supposed to possess. Among the Pacific Northwest peoples, Raven steals the sun from a chief who had locked it away in a box. Among the Norse, the mead of poetry is taken by Odin from the giant Suttung in a long and intricate deception. The variations are endless. The structure is constant. Whatever has made human life rich, whatever has made human consciousness possible, whatever has made civilization endure, was originally held by someone else, and was acquired by a younger or smaller figure through some combination of cunning, theft, and risk. What does it mean that this motif is so universal? The standard interpretation, offered by structuralist anthropologists across the 20th century, is that the motif reflects a deep psychological pattern. Humans, the argument goes, instinctively feel that their own civilization is incomplete, secondary, dependent upon something that came before them, and they project this feeling outward into myths of theft and transfer. The motif is internal. It says nothing about the actual history of civilization. It says only something about how human beings cannot help feeling, when they look at their own institutions, that those institutions must have come from somewhere older than themselves. But this interpretation, however reasonable, sidesteps a more uncomfortable question. Why is the feeling itself so universal? Why does every culture independently settle upon the same conclusion? Why does the experience of being civilized seem to carry embedded within it the conviction that civilization is borrowed, inherited, or stolen rather than originally one's own? Could it be that the conviction is itself a kind of memory? Not necessarily a memory of a specific historical theft, but a memory that the patterns of civilized life arrived with such suddenness, such completeness, such evident sophistication, that the people who first inherited them could only explain their possession by imagining that someone, somewhere, had taken them from a prior keeper. The archaeology of the very earliest Mesopotamian cities reinforces this unease. The transition from village agriculture to full urban civilization at Uruk, between roughly 3500 and 3000 before the Common Era, occurs across a span of only a few centuries, and produces in that span almost every defining feature of urban life that would persist for the next 5,000 years. Writing, monumental architecture, the wheel-thrown pottery, the cylinder seal, the accounting system, the temple bureaucracy, the administrative state, none of it slow, none of it gradual. The Uruk phenomenon, as the archaeologists now call it, is a quiet explosion. A civilization that appears, by any reasonable comparison, to have arrived with its instructions already written. And to the Sumerians who lived through its rise, the explanation seemed obvious. The decrees had not been developed. The decrees had been taken from somewhere they had been kept for a very long time. And the one who kept them, the one from whose archive they were drawn, was the one figure in the entire pantheon who never tried to take them back by force. He could have, he had the power. He had the storm demons and the sea monsters and the wisdom of the deep waters. But after Inanna's flight, after the loss was complete, Enki, the wise god, simply let the matter rest. As if he understood in some way the younger goddess did not, that what had been transferred could not be untransferred, that once the decrees were loosed upon the world, they could never be recalled to a single sanctuary again. That civilization, having begun to flow, would now flow forever, regardless of who pretended to govern it. And in that quiet acceptance, in that strange and almost paternal resignation, there is buried perhaps the deepest secret of the Mesopotamian theology. The keepers of civilization, the texts seem to suggest, were never really its owners, they were only its witnesses. And what they witnessed was something far older than themselves. Among the 7 who decreed the fates, there is one whose name has been almost entirely forgotten by the modern world, and yet whose face appears more often than any other upon the oldest seals and amulets of southern Mesopotamia. It's the mother, the mountain, the one who shapes the womb. Her oldest name was Ninhursag, the lady of the foothills, though she was called by many others across the long centuries of her worship. Ninma, the exalted lady, Damgal-Nuna, the great consort, Mami, the maternal one, from whose name some linguists have traced the very word mama across the unrelated language families of the world. She was the assistant who knelt beside Enki at the clay pits when the first humans were formed. She was the one whose hands shaped what his wisdom only designed. She was, by every careful reading of the surviving texts, the indispensable counterpart to every act of creation that the male gods claimed for themselves. What is strange is how thoroughly her cult was eventually marginalized. In the earliest layers of Sumerian religion, Ninhursag stands among the very greatest. Her temples at Kesh and Adab are honoured across the region. Her name is invoked alongside Anu and Enlil and Enki in the most formal of treaties. The Sumerian king list notes that several early dynasties traced their legitimacy through her sanctuary, and yet by the time the Babylonian period rises in the second millennium, her role has shrunk to a domestic deity of birth and midwifery. By the Assyrian period, she has nearly vanished from the public liturgies entirely. By the Persian and Hellenistic eras, even the priests of her former temples have forgotten the exact rituals that once attended her worship. The mother of humanity, the shaper of the first clay, becomes, across roughly 2,000 years, a name barely whispered in the back rooms of foreign temples. The pattern is familiar. It is the same pattern by which the great goddess traditions of nearly every ancient culture were slowly stripped of their authority. The Egyptian Hathor, originally a vast cosmic deity, is gradually folded into the worship of Isis, and Isis in turn is absorbed by the rising priesthoods that would treat her as merely the mourning wife of a male god. The Anatolian Cybele is taken by the Greeks and renamed as something smaller. The Cretan snake goddess of the Bronze Age is overwritten by the Olympian pantheon, and barely survives even as a footnote. The Indo-European Prithivi Mata, the Earth Mother of the Vedic hymns, is reduced over the millennia to a single late dedicatory mention in a tradition that came to celebrate her sons instead. The diminishment of Ninhursag is not an isolated event. It is part of a continental, multi-millennial shift in which the maternal source of creation is slowly transferred to the periphery of religious memory, and the male sky and storm gods take the centre. What the texts of Ninhursag's worship preserve, however, is something that the later traditions could not quite replicate. A composition known as Enki and Ninhursag, recovered from tablets first published in the 1910s, records what is perhaps the oldest paradise narrative ever written. The setting is Dilmun, a place described in the Sumerian text as the land where lions do not kill, where wolves do not snatch the lamb, where the dove does not droop its head, where the eyes of the diseased do not say I am diseased, where the elder does not say I am old. It is, by every detail, a description of a world before death, before suffering, before the imperfections that would come to define the human condition. And it is located, the text says, somewhere to the east, beyond the marshes, beyond the gulf at the rising of the sun. The parallels with the Hebrew account of Eden are so close that the most reasonable explanation is direct cultural transmission. Both narratives describe a primordial garden. Both place it eastward. Both feature a serpent or serpent-like figure. Both involve a transgression involving forbidden plants. Both result in expulsion or consequence. The Sumerian version, however, was written down at least 1,000 years before the Hebrew, when philologists have argued for a gap of as much as 2,000 years between the composition of Enki and Ninhursag and the redaction of the Genesis material. The dependence of the younger tradition upon the older has been quietly conceded by mainstream biblical scholarship since the late 19th century, even as the popular religious imagination has remained largely unaware of it. What the Sumerian version contains, however, that the Hebrew version stripped away is the role of the goddess. In Enki and Ninhursag, the wise god offends his counterpart by consuming 8 plants that he should not have touched. He falls ill. 8 specific parts of his body grow sick, 1 for each plant. The other gods watch helplessly as the deep one weakens. None of them can heal him. None of them know how. It is only when Ninhursag is persuaded to return and to place him in her vulva, an image that has scandalized many translators and been politely softened in nearly every published edition, that the healing begins. From her body she brings forth one by one 8 healing deities, Each is named for the part of Enki that had grown ill. Each is born to address the specific damage that his transgression caused. The last of them, Ninti, has been the subject of perhaps the most controversial linguistic argument in the history of comparative mythology. Nin meaning lady, Tai meaning both rib and life, the lady of the rib, the lady of life. The pun is exact, the pun is impossible to render in any other language. And the Hebrew narrative of Eve, the woman formed from Adam's rib, who is also named Chava, the mother of all living, preserves both halves of the Sumerian pun in a way that no monolingual Hebrew speaker would ever have invented. The implication is enormous, and it has unsettled biblical scholarship for over a century. The Eve of Genesis is not a Hebrew creation. She is a translation of a pun that only worked in Sumerian. She is, in the most literal possible sense, a foreign import, retained in the later tradition, even though the wordplay that originally generated her name had been lost. And what was retained alongside her, though increasingly obscured, was the older theology in which the rib, the side, the curved bone of the body, was the place where the mother goddess performed her healing. The Hebrew text turns this into a story of female derivation from the male. The Sumerian text remembered it the other way around. The woman emerged because the goddess was needed. The man could not heal himself. The mother had to be called back. What was lost when this reversal occurred? When the male tradition rewrote the female source of healing into a derivative bone of male anatomy, may be more than a single mythological detail. It may be the deliberate erasure of an entire framework of religious understanding, one in which the act of creation was never the work of a single solitary deity, but always the collaboration of an architect and a shaper, a designer and a body, a wisdom and a womb. The Sumerians remembered this. The traditions that came after did not. And what their forgetting cost the world is a question that haunts every careful reader of the older tablets, where the lady of the foothills still kneels at the clay pits, still places her hand upon the wound, still calls forth life from a body that the men of the council no longer know how to mend. The traveller who walks tonight upon the dunes of southern Iraq, at the place the local Arabic still calls Tel el Mukayyar, the mound of pitch, will find rising before him in the desert the only ziggurat in all of Mesopotamia that still stands at something close to its original height. Its great staircases climb the southwestern face. Its 3 monumental ramps converge toward a platform where, more than 4,000 years ago, a smaller shrine once crowned the entire structure. It is the ziggurat of Ur, and the god to whom it was dedicated, the god in whose honour the kings of the Third Dynasty raised this colossal terrace of baked brick and bitumen, was not Anu, nor Enlil, nor Enki. It was the moon. The Sumerians called him Nanna. The Akkadians, in their later tongue, called him Sin. He was the firstborn of Enlil and Ninhursag, the first child of the storm and the spirit of the open field, and his birth was, according to one of the most haunting compositions ever recovered from cuneiform tablets, accompanied by a strange and disquieting episode that the priests of his cult never tried to soften. His mother had descended into the underworld at his conception, and Nanna himself was, in the deepest reading of the texts, a child of darkness as much as of light. The pale disk that he became sailing nightly across the heavens in his curved boat was understood to be the very vessel that had carried him up out of the realm of the dead at his birth. The moon in Mesopotamian theology was not merely a light, it was a survivor. It was the one who had returned. This perhaps is why his worship took such deep root at Ur, the city on the lower Euphrates that flourished, vanished, returned, vanished again, and lingers now only as a name borrowed by half the religions of the Western world. For if there is any place on earth that has carried the trace of repeated descent and return, it is Ur. The city is mentioned in the Hebrew scripture as the home of Abraham, the patriarch who is said to have left it under divine command to wander toward the land that would later become Israel. The reference is brief, almost a passing detail. Ur of the Chaldees, the text says, as if every reader would already know what such a place meant. And for centuries the location of this city was disputed by biblical scholars who could not quite agree where to find it. It was only in the 1920s, when the British archaeologist Leonard Woolley uncovered the royal cemetery beneath the dunes of the Qaits of Tel el-Makaya, that the question seemed to be answered, though even now there remain serious arguments for a northern alternative in Upper Mesopotamia, near modern Shanluofa, where the worship of the moon also ran deep. What Woolley found beneath the desert floor disturbed the world that read his reports. The royal tombs of were not the simple burials of kings. They were complex chambers in which dozens of attendants, soldiers, musicians and ladies of the court had been deliberately placed alongside their masters. Some of them, the skeletons revealed, had been arranged in ordered rows, their cups still resting at their hands, as if they had drunk something before lying down. The interpretation, debated then and debated still, was that they had been led down into the burial pit alive, given a poisoned draught, and arranged in their final positions while the moon god watched from his ziggurat above. Whether this is the correct reading is uncertain. Some recent forensic studies have suggested that the deaths may have been less peaceful than the wine cup arrangement implies, with evidence of blunt force trauma at the base of some of the skulls. But what is not in dispute is that the burials at were undertaken on a scale, and with a ritual complexity, that has almost no parallel anywhere else in early Mesopotamia. The city of the moon god was the city of the most elaborate descent into the underworld that the ancient world ever recorded. Why the moon? Why should the worship of the silver disk, the nightlight, the changing face above the floodplains have produced such an intensity of devotion in this one place? Part of the answer lies in the practical importance of the lunar cycle to early Mesopotamian life. The calendar of Sumer was, from its earliest documented form, a lunar one. The months were measured by the appearances of the new moon. The festivals were timed by the phases. The interest rates on barley loans were calculated by the lunar count. The very word for month in Sumerian iti was etymologically related to the word for moon. To know the moon was to know time. To know time was to know when to plant, when to harvest, when to give birth, when to bury. The god who governed the lunar cycle governed, in the most practical possible sense, the entire structure of human life. But the practical explanation does not exhaust the theological one. The Mesopotamian worship of Nanna carried with it a deeper claim, one that the priests of held closely and rarely articulated for outsiders. Nanna, they said, was the father of Utu the sun, and Inanna the morning star. The moon was older than the day, the moon was older than the planets. The moon had been there when the world was still half-shaped from the waters, and the moon had watched as Anu withdrew, and Enlil ascended, and Enki laboured in the deep. The moon was, in a sense, the priests of understood but never published, the eldest witness, the one who had seen the entire story unfold and remembered it without alteration. And whatever the moon remembered, the priests believed, could still be consulted through the proper rituals, through the careful observation of its motions, through the long lineages of astronomical scribes who recorded its appearances generation after generation across the broad and ancient nights. The astronomical achievement of these scribes is staggering. The tablets known to modern scholars as the Mul, Apin series, in their preserved form dating to the early first millennium before the Common Era, but drawing upon traditions reaching back at least to the mid-second, contain the most sophisticated record of celestial observation ever compiled before the Hellenistic Age. They list the periods of the planets. They track the cycles of eclipses with a precision that approaches the modern. They record the appearances of stars with a careful regularity that allows scholars today to date specific tablets to within decades by checking when certain conjunctions actually occurred. The Babylonian astronomers who inherited the Sumerian tradition could predict lunar eclipses by the period now called the Saros cycle, 18 years and roughly 11 days, the same cycle modern astronomers still use derived directly from clay tablets that were already old when the prophets of the Hebrew Bible were said to have walked. How did this knowledge accumulate? The standard answer is that it was the patient work of many centuries of careful observation by trained scribes attached to temple complexes, and this is undoubtedly true in part. But it is also incomplete, because the earliest layers of the Mesopotamian astronomical tradition already show a sophistication that requires generations of prior development. The Sumerians did not begin from naive observation and slowly refine their understanding. They began with frameworks already in place. They began, like everything else in their civilization, with the instructions already partly written. And the question that has haunted every honest historian of ancient science is the same question that haunts every other aspect of the Sumerian inheritance. Where did the framework come from? Who had been watching the sky long enough to give them what they began with? And why, of all the gods of the pantheon, was it the moon, the witness, the survivor of descent? Who became the keeper of that observation? In the long catalogue of forgotten kings, there is one whose obsessions still trouble the historians who try to make sense of them. He was the last native ruler of Babylon, the final inheritor of a civilization that had already lasted, by his own time, longer than the entire span between his death and the present day. His name was Nabonidus. He came to the throne in the year 556 before the Common Era, in a city that had stood for nearly 2,000 years, that had absorbed and reabsorbed the religious traditions of Sumer, that had become the cultural capital of the entire ancient Near East. And almost from the moment he was crowned, Nabonidus began to behave in ways that no Babylonian king before him had ever attempted, and that none would ever attempt again because his dynasty did not survive what he did. He turned away from Marduk. He turned away from the patron god of Babylon, the deity in whose temple every legitimate king was required to clasp the hands of the divine statue at the New Year festival. Without that ritual, no Babylonian reign could be considered fully authorized, and Nabonidus refused year after year to perform it. The contemporary chronicles, written by scribes who clearly disapproved of his choices, record his absences with a tight-lipped precision that still bristles across the centuries. The king did not come to Babylon. The king did not take the hands of Marduk. The festival did not occur. The New Year passed unritualized. Something was wrong at the heart of the empire, and the priests of Marduk, whose authority depended upon the festival, watched their king turn his face away from them and toward another god entirely. That other god was Sin, the moon. The deity whose worship had originated in distant Ur and Haran, the two great cities of the moon cult, one in the south of Mesopotamia and one in the north. Nabonidus, the surviving texts insist, was devoted to Sin in a way that bordered on the obsessive. He restored the moon temples that had fallen into ruin. He rebuilt the Ziggurat of Ur to a finer state than it had stood in for centuries. He commissioned new statues of the moon god to replace those that had been damaged or lost. He attempted, in language that the Marduk priests of Babylon found scandalous, to elevate Sin to the position of supreme deity of the entire empire, and then, in an act that the chronicles still struggle to explain, he abandoned Babylon altogether. He took up residence in the distant oasis city of Timur, in the north of the Arabian Peninsula, hundreds of miles from his capital. He remained there for 10 full years. What was he doing? The official accounts, written by his successors who had every reason to portray him as deluded, claim that he had gone mad, that he had been struck with some divinely inflicted affliction, that he had withdrawn into a religious paranoia from which he could no longer be reached. The later Hebrew tradition in the Book of Daniel would preserve a confused echo of this story, attributing it to Nebuchadnezzar instead of to Nabonidus, in which the king lives for 7 years like an animal in the wilderness before being restored to his senses. The historicity of the displacement is debated, but the parallel with the actual records of Nabonidus at Timur is too close to be coincidental. Something happened in those 10 years, something the Babylonian establishment did not wish to remember accurately. What the modern excavations at Timur and at the related site of Sela have begun to suggest is far stranger than any of the ancient accusations of madness. Nabonidus appears to have been conducting, during his decade in the desert, a sustained program of religious and archaeological investigation. He was searching, he was digging, he was excavating the ruined sanctuaries of older cities, examining the foundation deposits, reading the building inscriptions of kings who had died 1500 years before his birth, recording their findings on his own commemorative cylinders. He has been called, with some justification, the world's first known archaeologist. He restored buildings according to the original plans he uncovered. He returned ancient cult statues to the cities they had been taken from. He compiled, in essence, a kind of inventory of the religious past of the entire region. And the deity in whose service he was conducting this strange retrieval was always the same, the moon. There is something deeply unsettling about a king who at the height of his political power abandons his capital, walks into the desert, and devotes 10 years to excavating the ruined temples of an older world. It is not the behaviour of a man who is satisfied with the religion of his own age. It is the behaviour of a man who has come to believe that something has been lost, that the worship of his own time is not the original worship, that the gods his subjects pray to in his own city are not the gods who are actually present at the foundation of the world. And it is the behaviour of a man who suspects that, by going back to the older sanctuaries, by reading the older inscriptions, by reviving the older rituals, he might be able to recover something that his contemporaries had allowed to slip away. What Nabonidus thought he had recovered, no surviving text of his own composition quite reveals. His commemorative cylinders speak in formal language of his piety, his devotion, his restoration of the proper worship. They do not contain anything that resembles a confession. They do not say what he found at Timur, or in the foundations of the Ur-Ziggurat, or in the buried libraries of the older priest-kings. But the scale and persistence of his project suggest that he believed himself to be on the trail of something, and whatever it was, it must have seemed important enough to justify the abandonment of his capital, the alienation of his most powerful priesthood, and ultimately the loss of his entire dynasty, because Nabonidus' obsession ended badly. While he was in the desert, Cyrus of Persia was assembling the army that would, within months of the king's eventual return, conquer Babylon without significant resistance. The priests of Marduk, who had felt themselves abandoned for a decade, opened the gates to the foreign conqueror with what the chronicles describe as relief. They welcomed Cyrus as a liberator. They proclaimed him the rightful king. And Nabonidus, the last native ruler of Babylon, the man who had devoted his reign to the moon god and to the recovery of the older worship, vanished from history. The official Persian accounts do not record his death. Some traditions suggest he was exiled to a remote province. Others claim he ended his days in obscurity in Carmania. There is no tomb that has been identified as his. There is no monument his successors raised to his memory. He was, in every sense the ancient world understood, erased, and his project, whatever it had been, was erased along with him. The cylinders he had inscribed were buried, ignored, or melted down for their copper. The archaeological notes he must surely have kept have not survived. The libraries he had assembled at Timur and Harran were dispersed. The restored shrines of the moon god were left to fall once more into ruin, as the new Persian administration favoured its own gods, and the priests of Marduk reasserted their long-interrupted dominance. Within a single generation, almost no one in Babylon remembered what Nabonidus had been searching for. The next generation remembered him only as a madman. The generation after that barely remembered him at all. What does it mean that the first known systematic attempt to recover the religious past of Mesopotamia was conducted by a king devoted to the moon, and that the moment he succeeded in attracting whatever attention his work attracted, his entire civilization was conquered and his memory was buried? What does it mean that the priests of the city he had ruled were so eager to forget him that they welcomed a foreign invader rather than allow his project to continue? And what exactly had the last native king of Babylon found in the desert that the priests of Marduk could not allow the world to learn? When the moon set in the Mesopotamian dawn and the great pale disk slipped below the western horizon, the sky did not remain empty for long. From the eastern edge, where the alluvial plains met the steep wall of the Zagros Mountains, the second great light of the heavens rose to take his father's place. The Sumerians called him Utu. The Akkadians, in their tongue, called him Shamash. He was the son of Nanna and the brother of Inanna, the third generation of the great pantheon, and he was, in the curious theology of southern Iraq, junior to the moon in dignity, even though the modern eye assumes that the sun must always rank higher. In Mesopotamia, the moon came first, the sun followed. The night, with its patient calendar and its silent witnesses, was older than the day. But what Utu lacked in cosmic seniority, he made up for in a different kind of authority. The sun, the Sumerians believed, saw everything, not metaphorically, literally. There was no hiding place upon the earth that the burning eye of Utu could not penetrate. He climbed each morning from the gates of the east, ascended the dome of the sky, and from his higher seat looked down upon every road, every doorway, every courtyard, every field. He saw the merchant cheat his customer. He saw the judge accept the bribe. He saw the slave struck without cause. He saw the wife wronged by the husband, and the husband wronged by his neighbour. And, in the deepest layer of his theology, the layer that perhaps offered the Sumerians their first conception of an idea the world would later call universal justice, Utu was bound by his very nature to act upon what he saw. This is why the Great Law Code of Hammurabi, the most famous legal document of the ancient world, is crowned at its top by an image of the king receiving its provisions not from Marduk, not from any patron deity of Babylon, but from Shamash himself. The Babylonians, when they wished to claim that their law was universal, that it bound every citizen and every foreigner alike, did not invoke the local god of their city. They invoked the sun, because the sun belonged to no one. The sun was visible from every land, shone upon every people, witnessed every act. The sun could not be confined to a single sanctuary or a single priesthood. The sun was the only god who could plausibly claim jurisdiction over the entire surface of the earth. And it was from the sun, the inscription on the grate still insists, that the king received the authority to write down what humans owed to one another. The text of the code itself, recovered in the early 20th century from a black diorite pillar that had been carried as plunder to Susa in antiquity and rediscovered there by French archaeologists, is more than 280 laws long. It covers theft, assault, inheritance, marriage, divorce, surgery, agriculture, slavery, false witness, and the precise compensation owed for the various forms of bodily harm. Some of its provisions appear cruel to modern eyes. The famous eye for an eye formulation that the Hebrew Bible would later inherit is laid out here in its original form, with detailed schedules of which mutilations were to be visited upon which classes of offender. Other provisions appear startlingly progressive. The presumption of innocence is preserved. The right of the accused to confront accusers is enshrined. The protection of widows and orphans is addressed at length. The regulation of commerce is detailed with a kind of pragmatic specificity that suggests centuries of accumulated case law standing behind it. What is most remarkable, however, is not what the code contains. It is the assumption that underlies its very existence. The assumption that human conduct can be subjected to a written and consistent set of rules, that the rules can be discovered, that they exist, in some prior form, in the mind of a divine being who has already worked out what justice ought to look like, and that the king's task is merely to copy down what the god has decreed. This is not a small assumption. It is in fact one of the most consequential claims any civilization has ever made. because it presupposes that the universe contains a principle of order independent of human invention, and that human beings are not the authors of justice but its students. The implication, traced forward through the long history of legal thought, runs all the way to the modern world. The natural law tradition of medieval Europe, which would shape every later doctrine of human rights, of constitutional government, of inalienable freedoms, traces its philosophical lineage through Roman jurisprudence to Greek philosophy, and ultimately, however indirectly, to the Mesopotamian conviction that law is a celestial thing. The American Declaration of Independence, when it invokes laws of nature and of nature's God, is speaking a vocabulary whose deepest roots reach back to the diorite stele of Hammurabi, and to the assumption that Shamash, the sun, the witness who sees everything, has already determined what a just society must look like. Modern legal positivists have spent 2 centuries trying to dismantle this assumption, arguing that law is merely what humans agree it shall be, that there is no celestial archive of justice to be consulted. They have not yet succeeded. The intuition that there ought to be something more than convention behind the verdict of a court refuses to die in the human mind, and that intuition, traced backward through the strata of cultural memory, is a Mesopotamian intuition. But there is another aspect of Utu's theology that the surviving texts only hint at, and that has unsettled the more careful readers of the cuneiform record. The sun was not merely the witness of public justice. The sun was also the patron of travellers, the god to whom the merchant prayed when crossing the dangerous roads, the god whose protection was invoked by the soldier marching to unknown territory, by the hunter following game into the forest, by the messenger carrying letters across the steppe. And the texts that record these prayers contain a strange and recurring detail. The sun, they say, also descends. Each night when the disk sinks below the western horizon, Utu does not simply rest. He travels. He passes beneath the earth. He moves through a realm that the texts call by various names, sometimes the lands beneath, sometimes the night journey, sometimes the chambers where the dead reside. And in those chambers, the texts insist, he continues to do what he does by day. He judges. He sees. He carries the cases of the living down into the keeping of the dead, where they are presented before older authorities. And he carries back the testimony of the dead into the world of the living. He is, in the deepest reading of his function, a god whose office is not the simple illumination of the daytime world. He is a god of passage between realms, the sun who walks through the dark, the witness who speaks for those who can no longer speak for themselves, the one whose burning eye opens not only upon the streets of the living city, but upon something that lies underneath it. And the implication in the older Mesopotamian theology that the later traditions would carefully obscure is that justice is not merely a matter of what one does in the open air. It is also a matter of what one carries with one into the chambers where the eye of the sun continues to see. Long after the body has fallen silent, the descent of Utu into the night was not, in the Mesopotamian imagination, a passive disappearance. It was a labour, a daily passage through a realm that the surface dwellers could not enter, and from which the sun himself only barely returned each morning. And it was during one such night, in one of the oldest stories ever set down in clay, that the burning witness was called upon to perform a service for a mortal whose name would become, over the next 4,000 years, the single most enduring proper noun ever inscribed upon the substance of Mesopotamia. The name was Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh is, by any reasonable measure, the oldest sustained work of literature that has come down to the modern world. Its earliest Sumerian fragments date to roughly the late 3rd millennium before the Common Era. Its great standard Babylonian recension, the version most familiar to modern readers, was compiled in the 2nd millennium, copied repeatedly across the next 1,000 years, and recovered in the late 19th century from the buried library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal at Nineveh. when the British Museum scholar George Smith first deciphered the flood tablet in 1872 and read aloud before a stunned London audience a Babylonian account of a great deluge that predated the Hebrew Genesis by 1,000 years, he is said to have stripped off his coat in his agitation and danced around the room. The discovery of Gilgamesh changed the way the Western world understood its own scripture, its own literature, and its own sense of where civilization had begun. But what is less often remarked, in the popular retellings of Gilgamesh that focus on his friendship with Enkidu, or his quest for immortality, is the role of Utu within the story. The sun is not a peripheral character. The sun is the patron god of Gilgamesh's most consequential journey. When the king of Uruk resolves to leave his city, to cross the long roads, to enter the great cedar forest where the giant Humbaba stands guard, it is to Utu that he prays. It is Utu who grants him the 13 winds that will pin Humbaba in place when the moment of combat arrives. It is Utu who watches the road, who illuminates the path, who serves as the surety that the journey, however dangerous, will be witnessed by the eye that sees all things. The cedar forest itself has been the subject of considerable scholarly speculation, because the geography of the Gilgamesh epic, though deliberately mythologized, contains details specific enough to invite identification with actual places. Most modern reconstructions place the forest in what is now Lebanon, where the famous cedar groves once covered the mountains of the eastern Mediterranean coast before being progressively stripped over the millennia for the timber that built Solomon's temple. The ships of Tyre, the palaces of Persia, and the construction projects of every regional empire from the Bronze Age forward. Some readings, however, locate the forest further east, in the upper reaches of the Zagros Mountains, where Mesopotamian texts elsewhere place the abode of the gods. The ambiguity itself may be intentional. The cedar forest is, in the deepest sense, a frontier. It is the place where ordinary geography ends and the older geography of the gods begins. Humbaba, the guardian of the forest, is described in the surviving text with a strange and almost biological precision that has made some readers uneasy. His face is said to be a coiled mass that resembles the entrails of a beast. His voice is said to shatter cedars. His breath is said to be a deadly fire. His weapons are said to be the 7 auras, terrifying radiances that surround him and that no mortal can approach without being undone. Whatever Humbaba was meant to represent, he was not imagined as the simple beast. He was imagined as something that belonged to an older order of being, something appointed by an earlier authority to keep the forest closed against intruders. The texts state directly that Enlil had placed him there. The Lord of the Storm had set Humbaba as a guardian to keep the cedar grove sealed from human violation. And when Gilgamesh and Enkidu, with the aid of Utu's 13 winds, defeat the guardian and cut down the great cedar at the heart of the forest, they are not committing an ordinary act of conquest. They are violating a boundary that the older gods had established. They are crossing a line that the divine council had agreed should not be crossed. The consequences are immediate, and they are recorded in the text with a tone of dread that the modern reader cannot mistake. Enlil rages. The death of Humbaba and the felling of the cedars are presented not as triumphs but as transgressions, and in the second great quest of the epic, when Enkidu falls ill and dies, the implication is unmistakable. The death of the friend is the price for the violation of the forest. The gods have collected what was owed. Gilgamesh, who had sought glory and the protection of Utu, has won his battle and lost something that the battle's protection could not preserve. It is here that the Epis of Gilgamesh becomes, in the deepest reading, not a story about heroic action, but a story about the discovery of mortality. The king of Uruk, having tasted the loss of his closest companion, sets out upon his second journey, not to win further glory but to escape death entirely. He travels to the ends of the earth. He crosses the waters that no living mortal may cross. He finds Utnapishtim, the survivor of the great flood, the only human to whom the gods have ever granted eternal life, and he begs to learn the secret. The answer he receives is one of the most devastating passages in any ancient literature. There is no secret. The gods made humans mortal. The mortality is not a punishment. It is not a curse. It is the basic condition of being human at all. There is no escape. There is only the choice of what one does with the time that has been allotted. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk emptied of his ambition. He sees the walls of his city, the same walls he had built with his own labour years before, and he understands at last what they have meant. They are not a defiance of death. They are an answer to death. They are what one human being can leave behind, knowing that the body itself will not endure. He carves his story into stone so that those who come after him will read it. He stands upon the walls and looks out across the city he has ruled, and he speaks, for the first time, not as a conqueror, but as a man who has learned what every man must eventually learn. What is most extraordinary is that this lesson, this oldest of literary discoveries, was first written down by people who lived more than 4,000 years ago, in a civilization whose name was unknown to the world for most of the centuries that followed, in a script that no one could read for nearly 2,000 years until the patient labour of 19th century philologists slowly recovered its sounds. The Sumerians and their Babylonian heirs had already worked out, in literary form, the central problem of human existence that every subsequent civilization would attempt to address: mortality, loss, the question of what endures. And they had done so under the protection of the sun god, the witness who sees all, who travels each night through the chambers of the dead, and who carries forward into the morning the memory of those who can no longer carry it themselves. Utu, the burning eye, the patron of justice, was also the patron of literature. The light that illuminates is also the light that records. And what was recorded in his name has outlasted every empire that followed, and now lies before the modern reader as a quiet and patient witness to a civilization that knew far more about the human condition than its forgotten status has ever been allowed to suggest. There is one figure among the seven whose name has refused, across nearly 5,000 years, to be entirely buried. While the others have faded into footnotes, while Anu has retreated into philosophical abstraction and Enlil has dissolved into the storm and Enki has been quietly reassigned to the role of a clever trickster, while Ninhursag has been reduced to a domestic midwife, and Nanna has been transferred to the calendar, and Utu has been absorbed into the legal abstractions of later jurisprudence, one of the seven has continued to walk the surface of the world under different names, in different temples, on the lips of different worshippers, in nearly every century of the human story since her first appearance on the clay tablets of Uruk. She was Inanna. The Akkadians called her Ishtar. The Phoenicians in their Mediterranean cities called her Astarte. The Greeks adapted her into Aphrodite. The Romans in turn made her Venus. The morning star and the evening star, the planet whose movements still carry her oldest names in the astronomical record, has been the longest continuous object of human worship in recorded history. And the same essential figure, traced through every cultural mediation, every translation, every renaming, is still recognizable beneath the surface. What is it about Inanna that proves so impossible to forget? The other gods of Sumer faded as their cities fell. She did not. Her temples were rebuilt by every conqueror who passed through Mesopotamia. Her name was preserved in the Akkadian translations that followed the collapse of Sumerian as a spoken language. Her cult was carried west by traders along the Mediterranean coast. Her iconography, the lion, the eight-pointed star, the figure of the goddess with her hands raised in a particular ritual gesture, was copied and recopied by craftsmen who no longer fully understood what they were copying, but who could not bring themselves to abandon the image. Even within the strict monotheism that would eventually displace the old polytheistic religions of the Near East, traces of her remain. The veneration of the Virgin Mary in late antique and medieval Christianity absorbed iconographic elements that scholars have traced directly to the older worship of Ishtar. The Queen of Heaven of certain Hebrew prophetic complaints, the divine consort whose worship the writers of Jeremiah denounce, is almost certainly Inanna under a transposed name. The goddess refused to die. She simply changed her clothing. What is striking, however, is how far the later representations have drifted from the original. The Aphrodite of classical Greek mythology, the laughing patroness of romantic love, the beautiful figure rising from the foam of the sea, bears only a faint resemblance to the goddess the Sumerians actually worshipped. The Inanna of the original cuneiform texts is not a soft goddess. She is not, in any meaningful sense, a goddess of love in the modern romantic sense. She is a goddess of intensity, of contradiction, of the violent extremes that human existence can reach. She is the patroness of sexual passion, yes, but also of war. She is the protector of prostitutes and the patron of armies. She is the lady of the morning star, which is the herald of dawn, and also of the evening star, which is the witness to the closing of the day. She is youth, and she is the destruction of youth. She is desire, and she is the consequence of desire. The Sumerian hymns that celebrate her do not flatter her. They describe her as a storm that walks. They warn the cities that have offended her of what is about to come. They record, with the careful detail of those who have watched it happen, that her favour and her anger fall upon the same person in the same hour, and that no mortal who has dealt with her ever leaves her presence unchanged. The most famous of her hymns is the composition known as the Exaltation of Inanna, written by Enheduanna, the daughter of Sargon of Akkad. Enheduanna is, by any honest reading of the historical record, the first author in human history whose name has been preserved alongside her work. She was a priestess at Ur, appointed by her father to consolidate religious authority across the territories he had conquered, and she composed in the late 3rd millennium before the Common Era a series of hymns that survive on tablets copied for nearly 1,000 years after her death. Her exaltation is a personal poem. It speaks in the first person. It records the experience of a particular woman in a particular crisis, addressing her goddess directly and demanding her intervention. It is, in the most literal sense, the oldest piece of signed literature in the human record, and it is dedicated, with an intensity that has unnerved every modern reader, to Inanna. What Enheduanna's hymns preserve is something that the later Greek and Roman adaptations of the goddess almost entirely stripped away. The Sumerian Inanna is, above all things, a goddess of me, the decrees of civilization. She is the one to whom Enki gave away the entire archive of human culture in a drunken feast. She is the one who carried the gifts of the older world to her own city. She is, in the deepest reading, the goddess of cultural transmission itself, of the movement of knowledge from one place to another, of the strange and irreversible process by which civilizations inherit what they did not invent. Her city, Uruk, became the largest urban centre the world had ever seen because she was understood to have brought the gifts of civilization there. Her cult expanded across the Near East because she was understood to carry, wherever she travelled, the patterns of urban life that other peoples wished to acquire. Inanna was not the patron of any single craft or any single art. She was the patron of civilization as a movement, as a transmission, as a force that crossed borders and refused to be confined to any one sanctuary. This is why she could not be killed by the religious transitions that erased her sisters. The other goddesses were rooted in particular places, particular cosmic functions, particular cultic specialties. Inanna was rooted in nothing but the act of carrying. Wherever culture moved, she moved with it. Wherever knowledge was transferred, she was the figure who personified the transfer. And the act of transfer itself in the human imagination has carried her name across millennia, even when the language of her worship has been entirely forgotten. The morning star that the Mesopotamian farmer watched rise above the horizon at the same hour that the modern astronomer photographs the planet Venus through a telescope is the same physical object. It has been worshipped, observed, and named continuously for at least 5,000 years. The longest unbroken human attention to a single celestial body in the entire record of the species has been directed at the planet that the Sumerians first named for her, and that attention has not yet ended. But there is a deeper reason for her endurance, one that the surviving hymns hint at but never quite state out right. Inanna was not merely the carrier of civilization across the surface of the world. She was also, in the mythological reckoning, the one figure among the seven who voluntarily descended into the underworld and returned. Anu had withdrawn upward. Enlil had remained in his high chamber. Enki had stayed in the freshwater abyss. Ninhursag had retreated to her foothills. Nanna had passed through the underworld nightly, but had never been said to enter it as a deliberate visitor. Utu had crossed beneath the earth as part of his daily circuit, but had never lingered there. Only Inanna, the youngest of the great gods, made the conscious choice to leave her own realm, to enter the kingdom of her sister Ereshkigal, to descend through the 7 gates of the dead, to surrender, at each gate, a portion of what she had been, and to discover what lay at the bottom of the descent. And what she found there, what she brought back, would shape the human imagination of death, sacrifice and return for every civilization that came after her. The descent is described in the surviving tablets with a slow and unbearable precision. Inanna stands at the first gate of the underworld and is told by the gatekeeper who has been waiting for her that no one passes downward bearing what she now bears. She is wearing the shagura, the crown of the steppe, the diadem that marks her as queen of the upper world. The gatekeeper removes it from her head. When she asks why, he answers in a phrase that recurs at every successive gate. Quiet, Inanna. The ways of the underworld are perfect. They must not be questioned. She passes through. She arrives at the second gate. Here her lapis lazuli measuring rod and line are taken from her, the instruments by which the upper world is ordered and divided. At the third gate the small lapis beads of her necklace are removed. At the fourth her breastplate. At the fifth the gold ring on her wrist. At the sixth the rod and staff of her authority. At the seventh the pala garment, the robe of her queenship, the last covering she has worn. She enters the throne room of her sister Ereshkigal naked, stripped of every sign of what she had been on the surface, possessing nothing but the body she was born with and the consciousness that her body had carried. And the 7 judges of the underworld, the Anunnaki of the lower realm, fix upon her the eye of death. They speak the word against her. She becomes a corpse. They hang her body upon a hook on the wall. It is one of the most terrifying passages in any ancient literature, and its precision has unsettled scholars since the first tablets were translated. The sequence of 7 gates corresponds to a sequence of 7 removals. Each removal corresponds to a specific item of regalia. Each item of regalia corresponds to a specific aspect of identity, of social position, of accumulated cultural meaning. The descent is not a simple journey downward. It is a systematic stripping. The Queen of Heaven becomes, by stages, less and less of what she had been, until at the lowest point she is no longer anything at all. She is a body upon a hook, a piece of meat in the kingdom of the dead. What is more disturbing still is the explanation that the texts provide for why she went. The narrative offers several. Some surviving fragments suggest she went to attend the funeral of her sister's husband. Others suggest she went to extend her own authority into the underworld, to claim what her sister already held. Still others present the descent as an act of curiosity, of theological ambition, of a young goddess testing the limits of what could be reached and what could be returned from. The contradictions among the sources have been read by some modern interpreters as evidence of multiple traditions overlapping, but they may also be read more simply. The Sumerians themselves did not fully know why she had gone. They preserved several explanations because they could not settle upon one. The descent was a fact in the mythological record. The reason for it was already obscure when the first scribes wrote it down. What is not obscure, however, is the cost. Her body hangs upon the wall for 3 days and 3 nights. Above, on the surface of the earth, no one realizes what has happened, except her loyal servant Ninhursag, who waits, as Inanna had instructed her before the descent, and then begins to seek help. She goes to Enlil. He refuses. The Lord of the Storm declares that what Inanna has done is her own affair, that the laws of the underworld must not be disturbed. She goes to Nanna. The moon god refuses likewise. He will not intervene in the affairs of the lower realm. She goes at last to Enki, and only the wise Gaimd, the keeper of the deep waters, the one whose sympathies have always lain closer to the suffering than to the orderly, agrees to act. Enki shapes, from this dirt beneath his fingernails, two strange beings. The texts call them Kurgara and Galatura. They are neither male nor female. They are not living in the ordinary sense. They are something fashioned to pass through the gates that close against the living. Enki gives them the food of life and the water of life and sends them downward. They find Inanna's body hanging on its hook. They moan with Ereshkigal, who is herself in labour with grief, mirroring her cries until she grants them whatever they ask. They ask for the corpse. She grants it. They sprinkle upon the body the food and water of life. Inanna rises, but the descent has a cost that even her resurrection cannot erase. The 7 judges, the Anunnaki of the underworld, will not let her leave without a substitute. A soul must remain to replace her. A body must hang in her place upon the hook. The demons of the underworld accompany her back to the surface, prepared to take whoever she names. She climbs through the 7 gates in reverse, regaining her garments one by one, ascending into the light of the world she had left. And then, in one of the most chilling passages in the entire literature, she chooses who will descend in her place. She passes by Ninhursag, who has saved her, and the demons ask if they should take her. She refuses. She passes by her 2 sons who are in mourning for her. She refuses. She arrives at the city of Kulaba, where her husband, the shepherd king Dumuzi, sits upon a throne in fine clothing, untroubled by her absence, perhaps even pleased by it. He has not mourned. He has not put on sackcloth. He has not torn his hair. And Inanna, looking upon him, speaks the word of doom. Take him. Dumuzi flees. He runs. He hides in the wilderness. He prays to Utu to be transformed into a snake so the demons cannot catch him. The sun god grants the transformation. Dumuzi slips through the grass, but the demons find him anyway. They drag him down into the underworld. He becomes the substitute. His sister, in some surviving versions, eventually negotiates an arrangement by which she will take his place for half the year, allowing him to return to the surface during the other half. And this cycle, this descent and return, this division of the year between the upper world and the lower, becomes the agricultural and ritual foundation upon which every later, dying and rising god of the Near Eastern world would be built. The continuity is too dense to dismiss. Tammuz, the Akkadian form of Dumuzi, is mourned annually in rites that the Hebrew prophet Ezekiel still records, with disapproval, as being practiced at the very gate of the temple in Jerusalem in the 6th century before the Common Era. Adonis, in the Greco-Phoenician syncretism, dies and is mourned and returns each year. Attis, in the Phrygian tradition, undergoes the same cycle. Osiris in Egypt descends and is reassembled and rises. The motif of the god who must enter the realm of death and be brought back, the motif of the descent that requires substitute, the motif of the resurrection that depends upon a loss elsewhere, is so widely distributed across the religions of the Eastern Mediterranean basin that the comparative mythologists of the late 19th and early 20th centuries built entire theoretical frameworks around it. James Fraser, in The Golden Bough, traced what he believed to be the universal pattern of the dying and rising god across cultures stretching from Sumer to northern Europe. His specific arguments have been criticised and modified, but the underlying observation has never been overturned. The pattern exists. The pattern is too dense, too specific, too detailed in its parallels to be merely the result of psychological coincidence. And at the deepest layer of the pattern, beneath all the later refinements, stands Inanna, the goddess who chose to descend, the goddess who returned, the goddess who paid the cost of return by sending someone else downward in her place. Every later dying and rising god is, in some sense, a descendant of her descent. Every later mythological cycle of death and resurrection is a working out of what she first established when she walked through the 7 gates and surrendered, at each one, a piece of what she had been. The civilization of Sumer did not merely produce the world's first urban culture. It produced the world's first narrative answer to the question of how the dead might be brought back, and what the price of that return must always be. When the 7 are gathered together in the surviving compositions, when their names are pronounced in sequence by the scribe whose tablet has somehow survived the fires and floods of intervening millennia, what emerges is not a list of 7 separate deities. It is the architecture of a single understanding of how civilization was supposed to work. Anu, the remote source, the sky that authorized everything below. Enlil, the breath of command, the storm that enforced the decrees. Enki, the wisdom of the deep, the designer of the labouring species. Ninhursag, the body that shaped the clay, the mother who closed the wound. Nanna, the moon, the witness of cycles, the patient counter of months. Utu, the sun, the eye that saw all crimes, the judge whose justice travelled even into the lower world. Inanna, the carrier of civilization, the one who descended and returned. 7 roles, 7 functions, 7 pieces of an integrated system, and the system, taken together, accounts for nearly every domain of human life that the Sumerians could name: authority, force, knowledge, body, time, justice, transmission, the full vocabulary of how a civilization stands up and continues to stand. What is most strange is that the Sumerians themselves seem to understand this system as something inherited rather than developed. Their texts do not describe the slow emergence of the 7 from earlier and less organized worship. They describe the 7 as already in place from the beginning, already meeting in council, already issuing decrees, already dividing the world among themselves by the casting of lots. The system did not develop in Mesopotamia, the system appeared there, and the question of where it had developed before its appearance is one that the Sumerians did not answer, perhaps because they themselves no longer knew. The Babylonian priest Berossus, writing in Greek in the 3rd century before the Common Era, preserved a tradition that the modern world has never quite known what to do with. According to him, the wisdom of Mesopotamia did not originate among the Mesopotamians at all. It had been brought to them by a series of 7 sages, the Apkallu, who had come up from the waters of the Persian Gulf at the dawn of human history. The first of them, whom Berossus calls Oannes, was a being whose body was that of a fish, but whose head was that of a man, and whose feet were also human. He emerged from the Gulf each morning, taught the people of the coast the arts of writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, agriculture, and architecture, and returned each evening to the waters. After him came 6 more, each adding to the inheritance, each teaching what the previous one had not had time to convey. The 7 sages, in Berossus's account, were the actual source of Mesopotamian civilization. The gods came afterward into a world already prepared. The cuneiform tradition itself preserves the Apkallu in dozens of independent references. They are depicted on temple walls, they are invoked in protective rituals, they are listed by name in the catalogues of legendary figures. They are described with a consistency that the earliest archaeologists found bewildering, as having lived before the Great Flood. The Sumerian king list, which records the immense reigns of antediluvian rulers, places the Apkallu in the same epoch. Some texts present them as the advisors who whispered into the ears of the earliest kings. Others present them as intermediaries between the gods and the first humans. All of them agree on the central detail. The wisdom of civilization did not arise within Mesopotamia. It was carried to Mesopotamia by beings who came from somewhere else, from the waters, from beyond the horizon, from a place that the Sumerians themselves could no longer name with any precision. The standard academic position holds that the Apkallu are mythological projections, ways for the Sumerians to flatter themselves by claiming celestial origins for their own achievements. And this reading has the virtue of caution, but it carries within it an assumption that the Sumerians, alone among ancient peoples, would have constructed a flattering origin myth that systematically denied themselves credit for what they had built. Other ancient peoples claimed descent from gods, claimed favoured status in the eyes of heaven, claimed every kind of self-aggrandizing pedigree. The Sumerians did the opposite. They insisted that what they had was given to them, that the wisdom was not theirs, that they were merely the inheritors of a deposit made by figures who had already departed. It is a strange kind of self-flattery that consists in denying one's own originality. And it is an explanation that does not quite fit the pattern of how civilizations usually talk about themselves. The archaeological record, in turn, contains certain anomalies that the standard explanation has never fully accounted for. The sudden fluorescence of Uruk between 3500 and 3000, before the Common Era. The arrival of cuneiform in a form already substantially developed. The base 60 mathematical system whose origins are not traceable to any clear precursor. The astronomical observations that already presuppose centuries of prior watching. The sophisticated metallurgy that appears with little gradual development in the alluvial plains. The hydraulic engineering that begins with already mature canal systems. Each of these can be explained individually by reasonable accounts of cultural development. None of them can be explained collectively without invoking either a quite extraordinary local genius or a substantial debt to something older that has not yet been found. What might that older thing have been? Several candidates have been proposed. Some have pointed to the Persian Gulf basin itself, which was a fertile plain before the rising of sea levels at the end of the last glacial maximum, and which lies today beneath shallow water that has never been systematically excavated. The hypothesis that an early agricultural and proto-urban culture flourished there before the inundation, and that its survivors fled inland as the waters rose, has been advanced by serious researchers, including the archaeologist Geoffrey Rose, whose work on what he calls the Persian Gulf Oasis hypothesis has gained quiet recognition over the past 2 decades. Others have pointed to the older sites of southeastern Turkey, where Göbekli Tepe and its sister complexes demonstrate that monumental construction was already underway 11,000 years ago, fully 5,000 years before Sumer rose. Whether either of these locations is the actual source of the Sumerian inheritance cannot be determined from the present evidence. But what is no longer reasonable to maintain is the older confidence that the rise of civilization in southern Mesopotamia was a purely local event with no significant prior input. And so the question that has accompanied this long evening's drifting must finally be allowed to rest, not answered, not resolved, simply allowed to take its place in the quiet between the wind and the dust. Why does the oldest civilization on the human record describe itself as the inheritor of something older still? Why do its 7 highest gods govern the entire architecture of urban life with a coherence that suggests prior design rather than gradual development? Why is the wisdom in its tablets so consistently described as having been given rather than discovered? And why has every civilization that has followed Sumer, even those that have explicitly tried to repudiate its religious vocabulary, found itself reproducing, in altered forms, the same essential pattern of gods who decreed the fates, sages who taught the arts, descents into the underworld, and witnesses in the sky who saw all things? The answer perhaps is not available to anyone living. The records are too broken, the languages are too dead, the transmissions are too obscured by the long centuries of rewriting and forgetting. Somewhere beneath the soil of southern Iraq, in libraries not yet excavated, in tablets not yet translated, in the unrecorded oral memories of peoples long since absorbed into the empires that conquered them, the fuller story may still rest. But it may also not. The wind that crosses the dunes of Tel el-Makaya tonight has crossed them every night for 5,000 years, and it has carried no answer with it. The clay that was pressed by the first scribes has dried and fragmented and been carried into the keeping of museums in cities that did not exist when those scribes lived. The names of the seven are still spoken in the academic halls of a few patient scholars, but the worship that once attended those names has not been performed in any temple for 2,000 years. The bond between heaven and earth at Nippur is broken. The lapis blue beads that Inanna surrendered at the second gate of the underworld lie now in display cases under museum lights. The tablets of destinies, if they ever existed, in any form more solid than ritual metaphor, are gone. What remains is only the question. The patient, unhurried question that the seven gods of Mesopotamia placed at the heart of human civilization at the moment they first walked into the historical record already fully formed. Where did all this come from? Who was here before us? What was forgotten when the older world ended, and the world we know took its place upon the cooling ash of whatever stood here first? The tablet fades, the lamp grows dim, and somewhere out beyond the curve of the world, the morning star, the same star Inanna once named, rises now over a horizon she would no longer recognize.